I do a bit of climbing, hill walking, all that kind of thing. And something you do on long walks is periodically you just take a stop, have a breather, have a bit of cake, cup of tea, and you get the map out and make sure you are where you're meant to be and take note of where you are going next. And kind of against what we thought was going to happen this week, we just felt this nudge by God to have one of those moments where actually we just have a breather, stop right now, take a look at the map of where we are and where we're going to next. And actually on Wednesday night, as we were doing the prayer course, we were doing a listening exercise, and a few different words came from God during that listening exercise that all married together. We're like, okay, God's trying to say something to us as a community here that seems quite important. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you this morning. So apologies if you're expecting the prayer course, but it feels like God had other plans. So all that said, I'm going to open up the Bible now to our teaching text, which is in James chapter 1 and beginning at verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So a couple of years ago, I did my one and only half marathon. And up until that point, I've been doing 5Ks, the occasional 10K, and then a friend of mine badgered me into doing this run, and it was sponsored for a charity I really cared about. So I was like, okay, this was kind of worth doing. And much to my surprise, I was actually able to do that half marathon, but especially towards the end of it, I had no running form left. I wasn't running properly. My arms were floppy. My legs were everywhere. I was going left to right. It was not an efficient run. I looked and felt like I was about to die. But all around me were a mix of people, some of them who looked a lot like me. Getting towards the end of the race, this was the beyond anything they'd ever done before, absolutely ruined. But then there were these other people who were kind of running with this purpose, like they were running well, their form was still good, and you know, they were kind of focused on the end. They didn't look like they were dying like me, basically. And the thing is, the difference between those of us who were a human mess at that point and those runners who were like, you know, conformed and running and great is not actually the discomfort. If I could jump into their heads, no doubt that they were feeling their lungs on fire as well, and their legs were aching and sore as well, and their feet were reaching their capacity too. But I'm guessing that those people had run this kind of distance before. For me, this was the first time, and actually I reached a point where I'd run further than I'd ever run before. It was new territory for me. But they'd done it before, and I have no doubt that they had other runs lined up as well. In other words, this was part of their progression, part of their growth. And it's the same in the spiritual life too. There are some of us who are floppy armed, staggering left to right, completely inefficient run, all kind of like spiritual mess right now as we are into territory that we've never dealt with before. And that other people who are looking great, who, you know, got good form, who are concentrating. And the thing is, they are experiencing the same uncertainty and pain, emotional pain as we are, but they've been here before and they're going to be going for a while. And that is what this passage is talking about, is that actually when we factor in difficult circumstances like the one we're going through right now, it can actually become a joy. It can actually, those runners choose to do that. They choose to go through their pain thresholds time and time again, because as they do, they become better runners. Their body becomes more suited to doing this thing called running. And so it is with the spiritual life and walking with Jesus. You keep in those pain places, those places of difficulty and striving. And as you do so, your spirit becomes more accustomed to do it. You've run a further distance, you know there's more to come. And so the way that you run, the way that you spiritually run becomes more lined up, it becomes more efficient. You still feel that pain, but now it has a purpose. And in fact, our teaching passage for today from James 1 goes as far as to say is when you see it through that lens, it's actually a joy. Now, what I promised today is that we would stop and take a breather and a look at the landscape as is. And the landscape as is, I actually think, is probably not as good as some people are behaving like it is right now. And that's the first thing I kind of want to acknowledge. If we go back to week 1 of this whole pandemic for us, when things started to shut down, the word that God was speaking really clear to us right at that time was about Jesus in the storm, both walking on the storm and calming the storm. And as we, the disciples, were freaking out, he was not freaking out because he had authority over the storm. And it's amazing over the last year, as I've looked at other churches and other Bible teachers, what they felt like God's been saying through this time. And that theme of Jesus in the storm has come up time and time again. So it's not just us, Jesus was speaking to us about that, but other people as well. What I'd like to do as we assess where we are right now is just shift that metaphor very slightly and switch it from a storm to an earthquake. Say the thing that we have been through over the last year and a half has been an earthquake, because you get traumatic events in life, a death, a loss of a job, or even small things can be small traumas. And it affects one person. And from that one person, there's like a ripple out effect. It affects the people close to them, and then that affects the people close to them. And so you have this kind of isolated trauma that ripples out. But we've literally had a global trauma where the buildings have collapsed. The things that we relied upon have fallen apart. Our frames of reference don't work anymore. The way we used to be able to do things, we literally cannot do things that way anymore. And the things that we used to trust, some of those things have gone. Some things have changed forever. That's what happens after major earthquakes, is actually the landscape changes. And so there's been some of that, like the landscape has permanently changed in some places. In other ways, things that used to be standing for hundreds of years have fallen in all kinds of ways. Businesses have gone under, relationships have been tested and stretched and sometimes broken. The way that we used to do church for a very long time hasn't been possible for over a year. But what's happening right now is that some people are rushing to rebuild what was there before. So if we take the example of church, there's plenty of church communities who are trying to rush and get back as close as they can to how they used to do things before. It feels like over this last week, everyone has been outside and rushing to the town centre and the beaches and getting out everywhere that they can do. Some people are even risking foreign holidays again, all that kind of thing. And to me, it feels like that famous meme that's going around the internet where there's a dog, cartoon dog, sat having a cup of coffee in a room that's on fire, and the caption is, "This is fine." That's what I feel like looking at everyone right now. I'm like, is no one noticing that the earthquake is still happening? Just take the vaccine rollout, for example. We're only at 50% of people double jabbed, and we know the Indian variant kind of needs 2 jabs to be effective against that. All kinds of, we run a business. The coffee shop is a business. We know that is still a massive struggle, and we know our fellow businesses in Crosby, no one's having an amazing time right now. Everyone's kind of struggling to make ends meet. And then there's all kinds of weird crises going on as well, which no one's quite 100% sure why. House prices gone massively high. Hospitality, as much as it's struggling, also can't seem to get staff right now. People are struggling to fill positions. There's all kinds of bizarre things going on. And India is just in the worst place right now. Brazil has hardly recovered, and so on and so on and so on. Global rollout of the vaccine, they're trying to argue for that G7 this week, and that's nowhere near, so there'll be global instability for a while. And all that's to say that as much as we are all rushing to get back to how things were, and believe me, I understand that instinct, if we stop, take a look at the terrain as it's right now, there are still tremors, there's still an earthquake going on, and that is a terrible time to start building permanent structures. When the ground is unstable and unsteady, when there are still shaking and things like that happening, you don't build permanent structures, you build temporary ones. Like literally in earthquake regions right now, you build tents. You do not build concrete structures right now because it's simply not safe. They will fall over again. And you don't know how the land is going to finally lie. When the land does finally settle down, you should build differently to what you had. This is an amazing opportunity to build something new. I believe us as a church, and every church should take a breather during this moment and just ask, what church is God building in this time? And I will get to it later, but the word that God is speaking to us right now is precisely about this, that amongst us, and I hope amongst the broader church, God is rebuilding his church in a different shape to the one it had before, to fit it for a new work, a new thing that he is up to. But what I don't want to do is lessen the pain and the suffering of right now. I know that it hurts. Of course it hurts. We're in a transitional period. And when you're in a transitional period, basically everything's uncertain and everything's unknown. You don't know what's going to happen next. You're not quite sure. And that is exhausting and that is tiring. I just think it's really dangerous to pretend that we're in any other place. When you read through some of the psychological literature that's coming out right now, they're basically calling COVID-19 a global trauma. There's been this incredibly difficult and painful thing that's happened. And, it's a global thing that's caused all these isolated things. So again, the earthquake is the global thing, but the buildings fall down at the isolated things, the failed relationships, the death, the mourning, the grief, the loss of jobs, those kind of things have been happening to everyone. And the ripples from that have affected everyone as well. So we're just in this mess of trauma right now. And trauma is how we respond to these difficult things. But interestingly, there are different ways to respond to trauma. So for me, this last few weeks, kind of unusually for me, really, I've been emotionally kind of swinging. So I didn't tell even Lizzie this, so she's finding out about this for the first time. But like yesterday, I had to replace our shower because our shower has been broken for ages. And basically I've been having showers in a temperature that's borderline painful for me because it's been so hot, but not been fixed, not having the time to fix it, but finally got around to it yesterday. And during the replacing of the shower and putting in this new shower, I went through every emotion. At one point, I felt utterly broken on the brink of tears. And by the end of it, I felt like the greatest human being that had ever lived, as this new shower was commissioned and working, and you could change the temperature, and it was awesome. And that was just like a microcosm of what's been like for me, honestly, over the last few weeks. Like, generally speaking, emotionally, I'm a bit more of a kind of flat level type person. But recently, oh my goodness, I've been having moments where I just couldn't believe that I could carry on, that I seriously doubted my ability to do any of the job that I'm doing. I was afraid that, if we didn't rush back into the building and get everyone back meeting as church, that everyone would leave and go to other churches. And, that kind of fear and anxiety isn't that uncommon in church leaders, and that kind of insecurity, but I've honestly just never really struggled with it that much before. I've been quite laid back about that kind of thing. If people go, they go, whatever, and not that bothered. But just the last few weeks, I've just been like left and right and flying all over the place. And that's the kind of thing you would expect when you're passing through this period of instability. It's emotionally really, really difficult to deal with, but there are things that we can do with it to deal with it well. Or you may have seen, there's been an article that's been doing the rounds by an organizational psychologist called Adam Grant. And he didn't coin it, but he's made popular this term languishing, which is the kind of almost but not quite kind of depression stage. And if I was to give it a word, it would be the word meh. It's this idea of that after you've been through a year or more of basically fight or flight, running on adrenaline, everything's been different. Your emotional system is essentially worn down, and you're not quite depressed, but you're definitely not flourishing either. You're kind of in this middle ground of like, oh, just can't do this anymore. And the crazy thing is that's exactly the kind of situation that our teaching passage is talking about. A time of transition, a time of trials and temptations, of difficulties. And then at the very start, when it's talking about that kind of situation, it says, consider it joy. How on earth do we consider it joy? Well, if there's a joyful response to this, there's also the negative response to this. And quite often our negative responses to trauma are, in the West especially, because we're trying to control the uncontrollable. We're trying to make things happen that are outside of our sphere of influence. So these kind of responses, again, super common right now, are things like the incredibly high amounts of anxiety that are around, depression, the kind of outrage culture stuff, getting angry and blaming other people. That now manifests itself even in things like road rage, people having, kind of like midlife crises, and not just in their midlife, like questioning everything. For some people, it will look like workaholism, like actually. And that's one of the more dangerous ones. Some people will actually be throwing themselves into everything and working really hard. And that it's more dangerous because that kind of dysfunction is actually rewarded until you hit the point where you burn out massively. And then again, some people I know are hitting burnout right now. And you can see it in the political fallout that's going on and the just kind of general culture of anger that's around right now. And that is all a manifestation of people trying to control what is not controllable by carrying around anxiety, by trying to work their way through it, by blaming other people. But the biblical diagnosis of our lives and how we're to relate to the world is found in James chapter 4. Where it says, you say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this city and spend a year there, carry on business and make money. But you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. In other words, the Bible's saying you're not in control of half of what you think you're in control of. Acknowledge the fact that God is in control and you are not. You cannot control all of these things. And one of the interesting things of when you look at people who've actually done really well through times of trauma, they're people who've lived with extended periods of uncertainty. So we're talking about cancer treatments, long-term illnesses, losses as a child, instability moving around, all that kind of thing. The people who've come out of that well are actually amongst the most emotionally well and happy people on earth. In other words, the people who've learned to live at peace with that uncertainty are those who are the happiest. We tend to think the other way around. We tend to think that we have to be in a good situation to be happy. The truth is the opposite. It's what comes from the inside out. And the only place to learn to live well with uncertainty, which is the reality of our lives, we don't have the control we think we do, is actually to spend an extended period of time there. Now, I just want to take a side note to say, one of the other things that's really important once you've been through a traumatic event is grief. And we've spoken about that quite a few times because it's a really important part of our story as we went through a series of traumas and didn't realize that we needed to grieve. And it took us a while to learn how to do that. And it's a really important response. But I was listening to a podcast this week and the person on it just had this fascinating insight. Essentially this same one that I shared this morning, that the earthquake's still going on. And grief is a bit like an insurance assessment. It's where you stop, walk around all the damage, you notice the damage, but then you also feel the pain of that. You acknowledge the suffering that's gone, the unfairness and everything that's happened. And the thing is, you don't do that while the damage is still being done. and the damage has still been done. The trauma is ongoing. So it's too soon to do the grieving. There will come a time, and whether it's next year or a bit longer than that, where there's just going to be a massive outpouring of grief, and there needs to be for healing. But that time is not yet. That said, there's a smaller version of that that's biblically practiced and encouraged. And that is when whatever emotions we're feeling, whether they're positive ones, negative ones, high ones, low ones, we process all of our feelings with God. If you read through the Psalms, you will find language and thoughts and ideas expressed in there that you're not quite sure if anyone should be praying those things, because they seem almost blasphemous. They seem theologically wrong. But we're actually encouraged to not edit our feelings and our thoughts and our prayers when we come to God. We're supposed to bring every emotion we have to God in prayer, and we can do that right now. It's not quite the time to have that moment of marking the grief and the loss, but we can always process our emotions. That's a side note. The main thing I want to talk about today is that actually God often uses or even prefers to use the times of deep instability and uncertainty to form us as people. And that's what he seems to be wanting to do with us in this period, actually use this terrible moment to change who we are as people. Because these transitional moments, these times of uncertainty where we're moving from something we know to something we don't know, and we don't know what's going to happen next, and everything's foggy and unsure, are actually extraordinary times for growth. To take it away from the personal for a while, the developments that we have made technologically and medically have always been greatest during times of war. That's actually the moments where we develop most. And again, emotionally, a lot of people would say that people who lived through rationing and the instability of the wars came out surprisingly emotionally healthy and well, compared to us who have until recently had so many luxuries and so much relative ease. It's actually in these distressing times, these uncertain transitional times, that we can grow the best versions of ourselves. And indeed, when God wants to make for himself a people, that's what he chooses to do. So God rescues his people out of Egypt, but then he needs to get Egypt out of his people, and he needs to make them into his people, his community. And so they spend 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years not knowing what's going to happen next or how long this is all going to take. And actually, when you read through the accounts of that, and just take note of how little they know of what is going to happen next. So, for example, when they get to the promised land, it seems to be a surprise and a shock to them that there's a military campaign ahead of them when they get to that. They just don't know what is going to happen next. And that seems to be God's deliberate choice, that they should not know what is next. Indeed, one of the things that is regularly biblically condemned is the use of mediums and divination, which was their means of telling what the future was going to be. God doesn't seem to want us to know what the future is going to be, but rather trust him in the here and the now. But as God is forming his people for himself in the wilderness, that is where they learn their foundational, essential lessons for the future. And some people talk about a Bible within a Bible, or a canon within a canon. It's this idea that certain teachings and certain books in the Bible kind of have more authority than others. And certainly in Jesus' day, they saw the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, as holding a special place, a higher kind of authority. And those 5 books happen and are learned almost exclusively in the wilderness. And it's only after you get out of that foundational teaching that you get into books like Joshua, where they actually start entering the promised land. But the important lessons are learned in the transitional place, the unknown place, the uncomfortable, uncertain, anxiety-ridden place is where God does his best works with us. And in James chapter 1 language, this is called testing or temptation, which is the same word in the Bible. And it's basically this idea that this is the place where we find out what we're really made of. And alongside finding out what we're really made of, we are also learning the lessons we need to learn. So it's something like Jesus gives his 10 commandments, and then there are 40 years finding out whether these people in the wilderness can live by those commandments. And it's often the same way for us. I've used the analogy too many times now, but like learning with God is more like learning to drive than it is learning from a book. It's not really a theory thing. It's something that we have to live out. It's a muscle memory, emotional reality kind of thing. That's how we learn. And when we go through these uncertain times, we will both discover what's really in ourselves, as well as learn and grow and develop. So I've used in the past, I've described this as a slinky. So I've got a giant slinky, and it's a little bit like God takes us on a lesson, which is like a complete loop. So here's the lesson, go through the difficulty, learn how to put it into practice, and you come back to the end and God affirms the lesson. And that's like a little loop, with a little upward move. We've matured a little bit more as God has taken us through this lesson. And so let's take an example of generosity. Say you don't give to charity, you don't give to church. Lesson number one, give something, anything to a charity or church. Okay, so God will prompt you, challenge you, maybe through something you've read in the Bible, something you hear at church, whatever, and you put a fiver in the collection plate, or you text the number to give to charity, whatever it is. So little challenge, put it into action. Let's see if you've actually got that generosity in you. First lesson learned. That was a little bit challenging, but I've got a little bit more generous. And now that little bit of giving is part of who I am. It's what I continue to do. And then at another point, God will challenge you to increase that generosity. Maybe you find out that most Christians give 10% as a minimum. So you're like, okay, right, 10% of my income needs to be given away. This is my next little challenge. And so you have to learn some budgeting skills. You have to cut back a bit more. It's actually a bit sacrificial. And you go through this testing time where it's uncomfortable. But by the end of it, you're now giving 10% regularly, and you've gone up that next little bit of the spiral. And so it will keep going on this generosity spiral as you mature and become more and more like Jesus. Or to use a slightly different metaphor, those parking ramps that you get in car parks, the multi-story car parks, where you kind of go up a half circle. It's a little bit like, you come at the ground level, learn a lesson, you go up that semi-spiral. You're on level one for a while, and then it's time to move up a level. So you go through that discomfort of the spiral again. Now I'm on level two. I'm living at more, and that's kind of how God matures as He moves us up through that kind of spiral. So to take an example from the last year and a half, there's probably an issue in your life or a person in your life who's difficult that you've been able to avoid this whole time. And in the trauma of the last year and the uncertainty, and as everything's changed, you've had to face that issue maybe for the first time. You've had to face it head on. So that's an opportunity to either mature, move up a level, to develop, listen to what God's got to say, or to run from that thing. And it might be helpful for you to right now to think of what is one of those things that has surfaced in all of this trauma and uncertainty that otherwise you probably could have avoided, but now you have to deal with. What is the thing? So for me, one of my things was that under stress and under pressure, I become kind of a bit chaotic and hyperactive almost and I start doing things that don't matter, and I start getting scatty and all of that kind of thing. So over the last just few weeks, I've started to learn how to journal, which is something I've actually realized I've needed to do for the last few years. The reason I know is because I have 2 empty journals sat on the shelf upstairs from previous years that never got used. But finally, the journal I bought this year has finally been opened, started to make notes in it. And through that, I can actually reflect on, okay, what's the important thing I need to do right now, rather than get scatty and distressed. And it's only because of the stress that I've been under, I realized, I'm not a reflective practitioner. I don't always do the things that really matter. Sometimes I'm not listening to God and not putting into action the things that God is saying to me. And so having had that exposed by the stress of the last year and a half, now starting to make changes. But one of the biggest lessons from this passage in James chapter 1 is that if we're going to put this into action, we need to do so consistently. To read it again, Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. Again, sounds crazy to us, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. So if that challenge and that response is step one, step two is to consistently keep doing those things. So to go back to the car parking metaphor, okay, you've learned that lesson of generosity, say, now you need to stay on level one and not drop down to level zero. So not let that be a one-off thing, but consistently keep on doing that thing. And once you've consistently doing that thing, you become a different person. You become a more generous person. That's who you are now. You live at level one. And as we said, at some point, God will then unsettle you and move you up to level two as you develop in your faith. But in order to settle on level one and not drop down to level zero, you need to keep doing things consistently. One of my favorite books of the last few years is a book called Grit by Angela Duckworth, who basically did research into child development and why do some kids do really well and other kids struggle in education and in life. And she found that there's this kind of multifaceted thing that determines which children go on to do well as adults and which ones don't. And she termed it grit, which is basically passion over a long period of time, passion and perseverance. Perseverance, our word from James chapter 1. But a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to an interview with her, and she said this really interesting thing that when she was younger, she had these friends who were incredibly close friends, and they had this intense friendship. And you know, what they did together felt like life and death, and it was absolutely everything. But she said, they're not actually the people I am still friends with today. The people I am still friends with today are those who kept calling. And that, when I heard her say that, I was like, that's a God moment right there. That's God speaking right there. In other words, you know, we take that into our spiritual life. Those who grow in Christ, who mature in Jesus, those who remain Christians until the end of their life are not those ones that exhibit the most passion, but those who keep calling, those who keep going to church as part of their routine, those who keep connecting with God as part of their daily habits. And I was really thrilled to hear, you know, someone in our church this week saying that the difference it made of making Wednesday nights part of their routine. I was like, yes, that's the thing. Because actually, when I was growing up in church, it was kind of popular to criticize things like quiet times and, you know, the regularity of church. And what we needed is more creativity and more passion and all that kind of thing. And I'm not, you know, creativity and passion and stuff is really great, but I've seen some incredibly passionate Christians burn out. And I've seen some very steady Christians remain faithful to the end of their days. And it's that perseverance, it's that keeping going, that's the most important thing. It's the connecting with God part of your daily habits. It's making church a habit. It's not actually a bad thing, that's a good thing, because the things that we do regularly are who we are becoming. You know, we've said it before, but your priorities are your priorities. If someone followed you around with a video camera through your days, logging everything you did, and then you added up the things that you did most regularly, they are your priorities. The things that you do regularly are the things that you prioritize, not the things you think are most important in your life, but the things that you actually regularly give your time to. They are the things that are important. And so one of the best moves we can actually make as Christians is to fit a habit of connecting with God into our daily activity, to make going to Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings a habit. And this isn't coming from my insecurity of, oh, I need everyone to come back. It's just our habits determine what's most important to us. And certainly add passion to that, absolutely. But perseverance is the foundation. And testing is a place where one-off incidents become who we are. They become habits. They become something we persevere through. And that takes a long time. And it's full of uncertainty, but that is where we grow. It's through running a 5K and then a 10K and then a half marathon that we physiologically change to become runners. It's through daily and weekly and annual habits that we become more like those who God called us to be. It's no accident that some of the teaching in that Pentateuch I was talking about is about the habits that God's people were to build in: daily, weekly, annual, 4-yearly habits, things that they would return to again and again, because that forms who we are. Heard an interesting stat the other week. It was American based, so I don't know what it is over here, but it said in America at least 50% of people are not renewing their gym memberships. Because what happens in these transition times, these times of uncertainty, is that habits change. So take that as an opportunity to build in some good habits. Do it a day at a time and start small. My goodness, do not create a whole new plan for your life where you're going to pray 5 times a day and you're going to come to absolutely everything that church does and you're going to serve in a million different ways. Then just take the next step, the next bit of the development, because spiritually speaking, that's how you do yourself an injury. If you try and overdo it, that's how you burn out. That's how you show this immense passion and then disappear off all disillusioned. Just start a day at a time and start small. The next step for you, build in the next bit of habit. So how on earth is it that in this letter written by James to a church that was suffering in a different way to us, but suffering as we are suffering, he could call it pure joy? Well, we've seen there are negative reactions to trauma, and we've been through all of those. But there's this other phenomenon that psychologists have noted recently called post-traumatic growth. That is, some people go through an incredibly traumatic experience and come out of it having grown as people. And that is why it's joy. He has to write in this letter, consider it joy when these things happen, because no one considers it joy. No one's going, yes, this is brilliant. I love the fact that I'm suffering and that everything's terrible. Like, no one thinks that's good, but it says consider it. In other words, take a step back like we're doing today. Look at the big picture, like the whole of your life. Look at even the eternal scale of what's happening. You could have had an easy life and kept living basically a lesser life, shriveled into a lesser version of what you were. The addictions could have grown. You could have become stingy. You could have become controlling and anxiety ridden. But instead, through God's grace, because we decided to walk it, persevere consistently with God, we became better people. We became refined. And this was the message that God was shouting clearly to us on Wednesday night. So basically, this wasn't planned, but we did a listening exercise as part of the prayer course where we listened to what God was saying to us. And 3-4 people all had words that seemed really similar. It was Pete's that first grabbed my attention because he was talking, God brought to mind a documentary you watched a while ago of how whiskey barrels are made. And if you start talking whiskey, then you've got my attention. And he's pointing out that whiskey is aged in barrels that used to contain other drinks, like bourbon or sherry or that kind of thing. And the reason is those other drinks strip out all the nastiness from the wood, so that when a whiskey ages in those used barrels, it just gets the nice flavors from the oak, the really lovely ones. But in order to make a whiskey barrel, you have to take this used barrel that so far had sherry in it, say, and then it has to be broken apart, hammered, and then put back together, fired up, beaten with a hammer into shape in order to be ready for whiskey. So this barrel, which had already been used, had already had this purpose in the past, got broken down and through a painful process remade in order to mature the good stuff. That it was only good for show before, but now it's good for Scotch whiskey. Now it's good for the really good stuff. And we had a lot of words around this idea that actually what God is doing with us as his people right now is refining us so that we are ready for a higher and better purpose, something that we weren't ready for before. And I consider that joy. I consider that a good thing, that, it's difficult and we've been broken apart and we've been remade. But through that process, God is getting us ready for something that we weren't ready for before, for a task that we couldn't have done before. It's making us into a different kind of people. I consider that joy. that we could have had an easy life, yes, but we're going to have a meaningful and a good and a purposeful one instead. So my encouragement for you is this, that God is forming you for whatever is next. If you will persevere, if you will build those habits, those routines into your daily and your weekly and your annual life, God will make you into something capable of something you weren't previously capable of. For us as a church, if we keep connecting to God, keep connecting to one another, keep being the church for one another, just as we were in the early days of the pandemic and everyone was helping out everyone in any way they could, keep doing those kind of things, keep loving one another, keep meeting together, keep doing the church kind of things, those churchy things, then God is going to make a community out of us, able to do something we couldn't have dreamt of before. So let's let perseverance do its work. The joy of maturity, of a new task that God has for us in the new season. So I encourage you, pick up James chapter 1, learn those few verses off by heart and use them as an encouragement for when it next gets hard, that actually God is doing a good work in you.